Have you taken a look at the country and the world? We've got big problems. Things could go very wrong in the future. They may not, but they could. Things are so uncertain, and that's what feels different today. There were problems in the past, sure, but things were more predictable. They weren't so uncertain. There's more uncertainty today than ever, and that's scary. Sometimes I wish we could just go back to the way things are, right? Lots of people talk like that. Some of you may be among them. For you, I've got good news. Now, I'm not going to tell you we don't have big problems. We do have big problems. And I'm not going to tell you that everything's going to be great in the future. Things could go very wrong in the future. But, however bad things are, however uncertain and scary they may be in reality, the fact is they're not as uncertain and scary as they appear. And I know this because I study the psychology of risk. And in particular, I'm interested in something called the uncertainty illusion. Now, to explain how the uncertainty illusion works, I want you to think of a good year in the past, right? A time when, and don't limit yourself to your personal experience, just think of any year in the past when there was peace and prosperity, when there was less uncertainty, when people were more carefree. Now, when I ask people to do this, a lot of folks will pick a year in the 1990s, of course, right? Seinfeld is on television, the dot-coms are booming, the worst presidential scandal involves, you know what it involves. Others will pick a year in the 1980s, because the 1980s is the era of soaring stock markets and lifestyles of the rich and famous. And other folks still will pick a year in the mid-1960s, the era of the Beach Boys and California Dreamin'. Pretty nice time. But a lot of folks, inevitably, even young people, will pick a year in the late 1950s, because a lot of Americans think of the late 1950s as a sort of golden era, right? What images come to mind when you think of the late 1950s? And specifically, let's try 1958, right? What images come to mind? Well, of course, right? Leave It to Beaver. You think of what else? Elvis Presley, maybe, sock hops, drive-in theaters. It was a pretty sweet time. And of course, there was a lot of prosperity, peace and prosperity. So we know this is the era of Leave It to Beaver. But let me ask you this. We think of it as a golden age. What happens if we go back into the archives and we ask ourselves, what were Americans in 1958 actually thinking, right? This is the cover of Newsweek magazine in November 1958. Now, if you know your American history, some of you may be a little confused by the images on this cover, right? There's a novel by F. Scott Fitzgerald. There's Charles Lindbergh and the Spirit of St. Louis. There's some jazz musicians, and right in the middle is a flapper dancing the Charleston. These are all images from the 1920s. So why are they on the cover of a magazine in the 1950s? The answer is because Newsweek is reporting that the big news in 1958 is that Americans are nostalgic for the 1920s. Now that's a little curious, isn't it? If 1958 was such a wonderful year, as we've all agreed it is, why were Americans living in 1958 nostalgic for the 1920s? Newsweek answers that in their story. The answer is because Americans were scared, and they were seeking shelter in the past, right? Here's a line from the story. In 1958, with its anxieties and uncertainties, the 20s have suddenly become a golden era, right? Anxieties and uncertainties in the era of Leave It to Beaver? What did Americans have to worry about in 1958? Well, as it turns out, they had lots to worry about, including one very big thing. Only a few years earlier, the United States and the Soviet Union had developed a terrifying new weapon, a weapon capable of wiping out whole cities in a flash. And now both countries were locked in a Cold War that threatened to turn hot at any minute. Of course Americans were frightened. They had plenty of good reason to be frightened. The question then is, why is it that when we think of 1958, We think of Elvis Presley and Leave It to Beaver, and we don't think of nuclear Armageddon. And the answer is, of course, we know nuclear war did not break out in 1958 or the years that followed. And thanks to a mechanism which psychologists call hindsight bias, that knowledge distorts how we see 1958. Hindsight bias is a simple cognitive mechanism. Basically, it makes the past appear predictable after the fact. The first psychologist to study hindsight bias, it was in the early 1970s, and at the time, Richard Nixon was preparing to engage in a major historic trip to China and the Soviet Union, and there was a lot of speculation about what Nixon would do, who he would meet with, and what would happen. And so the psychologists Baruch Fischoff and Ruth Bath went to people, and they said to them, can you answer some simple questions? Questions like, how likely is it that Nixon will meet with Mao personally? How likely is it that the United States will open an embassy in Beijing? And they took their answers and they filed them away. And weeks later, after Nixon's trip was completed, after the answers to all the questions were clear to everybody, they went back to those folks and they said to them, okay, you remember those answers you gave us? We'd like you to recall them as accurately as possible. Okay, it's very simple, just a memory test. But guess what they found? The psychologists found that people's memories were systematically distorted. If an event had happened, they remembered themselves thinking that the event was more likely to happen than they actually had before it happened. And if the event had not happened, they remembered themselves thinking the event was less likely to happen than they actually had at the time. Hindsight bias has been replicated in countless experiments, and it distorts how we perceive the past. And it is the reason why, when we think of 1958, we think of Leave It to Beaver and Elvis, and not nuclear war. When we look back in 1958, we know there was no nuclear war. Therefore, to us, it seems predictable that there would be no nuclear war. In fact, it kind of seems obvious that there was nothing to worry about, right? Which makes the 1958 look like the sort of carefree time of Leave It to Beaver. But to people living in 1958, it was anything but obvious that there would be no nuclear war. It was extremely uncertain, and that uncertainty was terrifying. Unfortunately, hindsight bias affects us whenever we look back at the past, whether it's a past we personally experienced or a past we only know from history books. When we think back to the mid-1960s, sure, we think of the Beach Boys and California Dreamin', but we don't think about all the fears that inspired another 1965 pop song hit, The Eve of Destruction. Or when we think about the 1980s, you think about soaring stock markets and lifestyles of the rich and famous, but we don't think about nuclear war, out-of-control crime, or a fear of AIDS so extreme that in 1987, true story, Oprah Winfrey told her audience that 1 in 5 Americans could be dead of AIDS by 1990. Or when we think about the 1990s, you think about Seinfeld and the dot-com boom, but you don't think about the crack baby panic, you don't think about the scare about super predators, you don't think about the widespread pessimism that made bestsellers of books with titles like The Coming Anarchy and Bankruptcy 1995, The Coming Collapse of America. Okay? Hindsight bias drains the uncertainty out of the past, and that makes the past look much less scary than it actually was at the time. So, let me put this together. Let me put the pieces together and show you how the uncertainty illusion works. Here I am standing in the present, and I'm looking around, and I see big problems. I start to worry. So what do? I look forward into the future, and I realize things could go very wrong. Things could go very wrong. Okay, what's next? I'm scared. Well, I'm going to try to compare this because I want to understand how bad the situation is. I'm going to try to compare the present to the one and only thing that the present can be compared to, the past. So what do? I turn and I look at the past, and what do I see? Thanks to hindsight bias, I see a past in which there was way less uncertainty. That means the present and the uncertainty I see in the present isn't normal. In fact, there's more uncertainty than ever. And now I'm really and truly scared. That's how the uncertainty illusion constantly makes the present and the future look more uncertain and scarier than they actually are. So, what can we do about this? Well, the first thing is read some history books. That's always a good idea. Watch some history documentaries. Also, open the archives. Spend a little time reading old magazines and newspapers. If you do that, you will very quickly realize that there are always big problems, there's always lots of uncertainty, and people are always worried about the future. That's valuable perspective because it protects you from feeling nostalgia for a past that never existed. And more importantly, it can protect you from becoming so frightened and so intimidated by the problems that we face now that you simply become a defeatist. You give up. You say, there's nothing we can do. This is too big. This is too scary. Right? That's how we can produce a future that truly is scary, is if we give up. Look, the simple truth is, people have always faced big problems. We're no different. Okay? If we think hard, if we make good decisions, we can tackle those problems. The uncertainty ahead will resolve in our favor, and we'll get along. We did it in the past, many, many, many times. We can do it again. Thanks very much.